Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I'm settling into my cozy little Stardew world while we dive into some absolutely wild stories that'll help you drift off to sleep. I've been doom scrolling through Reddit again, finding the most odd and unique tales that people have shared. And honestly, people are equally strange and admirable on Reddit. So grab your favourite blanket, get comfortable, and let's dive into some stories that will make you help you fall asleep quickly. Our first story involves a co-worker who decided that workplace refrigerators operate on a first-come, first-served basis, regardless of whose name is on the container. My co-worker Mason kept eating my lunch from the office fridge, and his excuse was absolutely mind-blowing. I work at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone has their own desk, but shares common spaces like the break room and kitchen area. We've got 2 large refrigerators that are always packed with people's lunches, drinks, and random leftovers that sometimes sit there way too long. I'm pretty particular about my lunches because I meal prep every Sunday. I spend a good chunk of my weekend cooking healthy meals for the work week, portioning them out into containers and labelling everything with my name and the date. It's not fancy stuff, just things like grilled chicken with vegetables, pasta salads, or homemade burritos. The point is that I put effort into making sure I have good food to eat during the work week. About a month ago, I started noticing that my lunches were disappearing from the fridge. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to bring lunch on certain days or had taken it home by mistake. But then, it happened 3 days in a row, and I knew something was up. I'd put my clearly labelled container in the fridge in the morning, and by lunchtime it would be completely gone. Not just eaten with the empty container left behind, but entirely vanished like it had never been there. I mentioned it to a few co-workers, and they said they'd experienced similar things. Apparently, we had an office lunch thief, which is frustrating enough on its own. But what made it worse was that I'd spent time and money preparing those meals, and now I was having to go out and buy lunch every day instead. I decided to get strategic about catching whoever was doing this. I made a really distinctive lunch, a bright purple container filled with homemade Thai curry that I knew would be hard to miss. I wrote my name in huge letters across the top with permanent marker and added a note that said, "Please do not take, this is my lunch." I figured maybe the person was just confused about which containers were communal and which were personal. I put the container in the fridge when I arrived at work around 8 in the morning. At exactly 11:30, I went to the break room to heat up my lunch early because I had a meeting scheduled during my normal lunch hour. The container was gone. I checked every shelf in both refrigerators, looked in the freezer thinking maybe someone had moved it by mistake, and even checked the trash in case it had fallen or been thrown away accidentally. Nothing. I was standing there staring into the empty fridge when Mason from accounting walked into the break room. He's this guy in his early 30s who's always talking about his various side hustles and investment strategies. We're friendly enough to exchange pleasantries in the hallway, but we don't really hang out or have much in common. Mason opened the fridge and pulled out a bright purple container. My bright purple container. He didn't even try to hide it or act suspicious. He just grabbed it like it was completely normal and headed toward the microwave. I walked over and said, "Hey Mason, that's actually my lunch. It has my name on it." He looked at the container and then at me with this confused expression. "Oh, I didn't see a name on it." I pointed to where I'd written my name in giant letters across the lid. "It's right there. My name's been on all my containers for weeks now." Mason examined the container more closely and shrugged. I guess I didn't notice, but I already took it out of the fridge, so I was planning to eat it. I told him that made no sense. Just because he'd removed my lunch from the fridge didn't mean it suddenly became his lunch. He needed to put it back so I could eat it. "But I'm really hungry," Mason said, like this was a valid argument for eating someone else's food. "And this smells really good. You're obviously a great cook." I explained that whether I was a great cook or not wasn't the point. The point was that this was my lunch that I'd prepared for myself, and he needed to return it. "Look," Mason said, opening the microwave and putting my container inside. "How about this? I'll eat this one today, and tomorrow I'll bring you lunch to make up for it. We'll call it even." I told him we would not call it even because I wanted to eat my lunch today, not tomorrow. I also didn't want him to bring me lunch tomorrow. I wanted him to stop taking my food from the fridge. Mason hit the start button on the microwave, and my curry began rotating inside. I'm just saying, it would be easier if I ate this now, since I've already started heating it up. It's inefficient to stop the process now. I reached over and stopped the microwave. "Mason, give me my lunch back right now." He actually sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Fine, but you should know that I've been taking lunches from that fridge for months, and no one's ever made this big of a deal about it before." I stared at him, processing what he'd just admitted. "You've been stealing people's lunches for months?" "I wouldn't call it stealing," Mason said, pulling my container out of the microwave and reluctantly handing it to me. "It's more like communal eating. If people leave food in a shared fridge, it's kind of fair game, don't you think?" I told him that no, food in a shared fridge with people's names on it was definitely not fair game. That was literally the opposite of how workplace refrigerators worked. "But think about it from an economic perspective," Mason said, launching into what sounded like a rehearsed argument. "Food is a resource, right? And if that resource is just sitting in a fridge not being used at that exact moment, then whoever needs it most should have access to it. It's basically redistribution of resources." I pointed out that the food was going to be used by the people who brought it during their lunch breaks. Just because someone wasn't actively eating their lunch at 8 in the morning didn't mean it was abandoned property. Yeah, but what if someone forgets about their lunch, or what if they decide to go out to eat instead? Then that food just sits there going to waste. I'm actually doing people a favour by making sure nothing gets wasted. I asked him how taking my lunch 30 minutes before I planned to eat it could possibly be considered preventing waste. Mason thought about this for a moment. "Okay, that's a fair point. But generally speaking, my system works pretty well. I've saved so much money on lunches by just eating whatever's available in the fridge." I told him that eating whatever's available in a grocery store without paying for it would be called shoplifting, and this was essentially the same thing. "But a fridge isn't a store," Mason argued. "It's a communal space, and anything in a communal space should be communal property." I explained that just because multiple people have access to a space doesn't mean everything in that space is communal. The fridge was shared, but the food inside it belonged to individual people who'd brought it from home. "I guess we just have different philosophies about this," Mason said. "I believe in sharing and community, and you're more focused on individual ownership." I told him this had nothing to do with philosophy. He was taking food that didn't belong to him, and that was theft no matter how he tried to frame it. "If you feel that strongly about it, maybe you should start keeping your lunch at your desk instead of in the communal fridge," Mason suggested. That way, there'd be no confusion about whether it's available for others to eat. I asked him why I should have to change my behaviour when he was the one doing something wrong. "I'm just trying to find a solution that works for everyone," he said. "If you don't want to share your lunch, that's your choice. But you can't expect everyone else to automatically know which food is off limits and which food is fair game." I pointed to my name written across the container. "The name on the container is how people know it's off limits." Mason waved this off. "Labels can be misleading. Maybe someone writes their name on something but then decides they don't want it anymore. How am I supposed to know their current intentions?" At this point, I was beyond frustrated. I told Mason that if I caught him taking my lunch again, I'd be reporting the situation to human resources. "That seems extreme," he said. "Can't we just handle this between ourselves like adults?" I told him that handling it between ourselves would involve him never taking my food again and also possibly reimbursing me for all the lunches he'd already stolen. Mason laughed like I'd made a joke. "I'm not paying you for food I already ate. That's ridiculous." I asked him why it was ridiculous to expect compensation for things he'd taken without permission. "Because I didn't know those specific containers were yours," he said. "If I'd known, I would have asked first, probably." The probably at the end of that sentence told me everything I needed to know about Mason's respect for other people's property. I ended up going to HR that afternoon and filing a formal complaint. Mason was called into a meeting and apparently tried to explain his communal resource philosophy to them. It didn't go over well. He was given a written warning and told that taking anyone's food from the fridge would result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. For about a week after that, Mason brought his own lunch and kept to himself. But then I started noticing that food was disappearing from the fridge again. Different people's lunches, always the good homemade stuff, never the sad-looking sandwiches or plain yogurt cups. I set up my phone to record the break room one day, hiding it on top of the cabinets where it had a clear view of both refrigerators. Sure enough, at around 11 in the morning, Mason walked in, looked around to make sure no one was watching, and took someone's pasta container out of the fridge. I took the video to HR, and Mason was fired the following week. On his last day, he sent out an email to the entire office explaining that he was leaving due to a difference in workplace culture philosophies and wished everyone well in their future endeavours. He didn't mention anything about stealing lunches. The funny thing is that after Mason left, I found out from other co-workers that he'd been making decent money and could easily afford to buy lunch every day or bring his own. He just genuinely believed that office refrigerator food was communal property and couldn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal about his redistribution system. That story is over. Mason really constructed an entire economic philosophy to justify stealing co-workers' lunches and genuinely couldn't understand why people objected to his unauthorized food redistribution program. Some people will build elaborate intellectual frameworks to avoid admitting they're just taking things that don't belong to them. Our next story involves a neighbour who apparently believed that my vegetable garden was actually a community farm open for public harvesting. My neighbour tried to harvest vegetables from my garden and got offended when I told her to stop taking my produce. I've been living in my house for about 4 years now, and one of my favourite parts of the property is the backyard. It's not huge, maybe a 1/4 acre, but it gets fantastic sunlight and has this rich, dark soil that's perfect for growing vegetables. I've spent countless hours building raised beds, installing a drip irrigation system, and carefully amending the soil to create what I think is a pretty impressive home garden. Every spring, I start seeds indoors under grow lights in my basement. I grow tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, cucumbers, lettuce, herbs, and whatever else strikes my fancy that year. It's become this therapeutic hobby where I can spend a few hours each week tending to plants, pulling weeds, and watching things grow from tiny seeds into actual food. There's something incredibly satisfying about eating a salad made entirely from vegetables you grew yourself. This past spring, I planted my usual array of vegetables and everything was thriving. The tomato plants were getting massive, covered in green fruit that was just starting to ripen. The zucchini plants were producing like crazy, which anyone who's ever grown zucchini knows is both a blessing and a curse. I had more cucumbers than I knew what to do with, and my pepper plants were loaded with jalapenos, bell peppers, and these beautiful purple peppers I'd never tried growing before. My garden is visible from the street if you walk by and look into my backyard, but it's clearly on my property, behind my fence, and obviously a private garden rather than some kind of public space. I've never had any issues with neighbours or passers-by bothering my plants. Most people would occasionally comment on how nice the garden looked or ask for growing tips, which I was always happy to share. About 2 months ago, I started noticing that vegetables were disappearing from my garden. At first it was just a few tomatoes here and there. I figured maybe some animal had figured out how to get into the garden, even though I'd been pretty careful about securing everything. Then I noticed that entire zucchini were missing, always the perfect medium-sized ones that were ideal for eating. The pattern was too selective to be an animal. One Saturday morning, I was in my kitchen making coffee when I glanced out the window that overlooks the backyard. I saw my neighbour from 3 houses down, a woman named Patricia, who I'd maybe spoken to twice in passing, walking through my garden with a large canvas shopping bag. She was moving between the rows of vegetables, examining plants and occasionally bending down to pick things. I watched in disbelief as she harvested several tomatoes, cut a couple of zucchini from the plants, and pulled up a few handfuls of lettuce. I immediately went outside and walked over to where she was kneeling next to my cucumber plants. She had already placed 2 large cucumbers in her bag and was reaching for a third when I asked her what she was doing in my garden. Patricia looked up at me with a friendly smile, completely unfazed by being caught trespassing and stealing. She explained that she was just picking some vegetables for dinner and complimented me on how healthy everything looked. She said I must have a real green thumb to get such beautiful produce. I told her that while I appreciated the compliment, this was my private garden and she couldn't just come into my yard and take vegetables without asking. I explained that I'd been noticing produce disappearing for weeks and now I understood why. Patricia seemed genuinely confused by my objection. She said that when she'd moved into the neighbourhood about 6 months ago, someone had mentioned that there was a neighbour who grew vegetables and was always generous about sharing. She assumed that meant the garden was open for anyone in the neighbourhood to harvest from. She said she'd been coming by every few days to pick whatever looked ripe and ready, and she'd been really grateful for the fresh organic produce. I clarified that while I did sometimes share extra vegetables with neighbours, that was completely different from people coming into my yard uninvited and helping themselves whenever they wanted. I told her that the vegetables she'd been taking represented hours of work, significant expense for seeds and supplies, and careful attention throughout the growing season. This wasn't a community garden or some kind of free produce stand. She told me that she'd been feeding her family with vegetables from my garden for almost 2 months. She said her kids had been eating healthier because of the fresh tomatoes and cucumbers, and she'd even made zucchini bread with the squash she'd harvested. She seemed to think this information would make me feel good about the situation, rather than more upset about the extent of the theft. I explained that regardless of how she'd used the vegetables, the fact remained that she'd been stealing from my garden for weeks. I asked her to return what she'd picked that morning and to never come into my yard again without explicit permission. Patricia looked down at her shopping bag full of my vegetables and said it seemed wasteful to put them back now that they'd been harvested. She offered to pay me for what she'd taken, pulling out her wallet like we were conducting a transaction at a farmer's market. She asked how much I wanted for the items in her bag. I told her I didn't want money. I wanted her to understand that you can't just take things from other people's property, even if those things are growing outside. I wanted her to respect basic boundaries about private property and personal belongings. She said she understood now and apologised for the misunderstanding. But then she asked if I would consider letting her continue to harvest from the garden if she asked permission first each time. She said she'd gotten used to having access to fresh vegetables and it would be hard to go back to buying everything from the grocery store. She mentioned that organic produce was expensive and this had been really helping her family's budget. I told her that my garden wasn't designed to feed multiple families. I'd planted specific amounts of specific vegetables based on what my household would use, plus some extra to share with friends occasionally. If I was essentially feeding her family as well, I'd need to either plant significantly more or accept that I wouldn't have enough for myself. Patricia suggested that maybe I could plant extra next year, with the understanding that she'd help herself to a certain percentage of the harvest. She said she'd even be willing to help with watering or weeding in exchange for a share of the vegetables. She was essentially proposing that I turn my private hobby garden into a community-supported agriculture program, with her as the primary beneficiary. I told her that I appreciated she was trying to find a solution, but the solution was simply that she needed to grow her own vegetables or buy them if she wanted fresh produce. My garden was for my personal use, and I wasn't interested in managing a sharing arrangement or coordinating harvesting schedules with neighbours. She seemed disappointed and made a comment about how neighbourhoods used to be more community-oriented and people used to share resources more freely. She said it was sad that we'd become so possessive and individualistic about things like gardens that were clearly visible from public spaces. I pointed out that visibility from public spaces didn't make something public property. She could see my house from the street too, but that didn't mean she could walk in and start using my furniture. The garden was on my private property, built and maintained entirely with my own labour and resources, and I had every right to decide who did or didn't have access to it. Patricia finally handed over the vegetables she'd picked that morning, though she mentioned that some of the tomatoes had probably gotten bruised in her bag and might not be usable anymore. She apologised again, but added that she thought I was being somewhat ungenerous given how much the garden produced. She said it wasn't like I could possibly eat all those vegetables myself, and that the zucchini in particular seemed to be growing faster than any one household could consume. I explained that what I did or didn't do with my excess produce was my decision to make. Sometimes I gave vegetables to friends or co-workers. Sometimes I made large batches of sauce or soup to freeze. Sometimes I let things over-ripen and composted them. The point was that these were my choices to make about my own garden. After Patricia left, I installed a simple camera system that would alert me if anyone entered the backyard. I also put up a small sign near the garden gate that politely but clearly stated this was a private garden and harvesting without permission was not allowed. For about a week, everything seemed fine. Then I got a motion alert on my phone while I was at work. I checked the camera feed and saw Patricia in my garden again, this time with her 2 kids. She was showing them which vegetables were ready to pick and helping them harvest tomatoes and peppers. I called her immediately and told her I could see her in my garden through the security camera. I asked her to leave and to take her children with her. She seemed embarrassed to be caught again, but tried to explain that she was teaching her kids about where food comes from and how to identify ripe vegetables. She said it was an educational experience, and she thought I'd appreciate that she was helping children learn about gardening. I told her that while teaching kids about gardening was admirable, she needed to do it in her own garden or in actual public spaces designated for that purpose. Using my garden as an unauthorised educational facility was still trespassing regardless of the noble intentions behind it. Patricia and her kids left, but not before she made sure to tell her children loudly that some people don't believe in sharing, and that's why the world has so many problems. I watched on the camera as they walked back to their house, and I felt frustrated that she was teaching her kids that taking things from other people's property was somehow a moral stance about community sharing rather than simple theft. I ended up having to report the incidents to our homeowners association because Patricia tried to bring the issue up at the next neighbourhood meeting. She presented it as though I was being hostile to families and children by refusing to share my abundant garden harvest with the community. Several neighbours who didn't know the full story initially seemed sympathetic to her position, until I explained that the issue wasn't about sharing but about repeatedly trespassing and taking things without permission after being explicitly asked to stop. The HOA clarified that gardens on private property were indeed private, and that harvesting from someone's garden without permission could be considered theft. Patricia was formally warned, and I haven't had any issues since then, though she hasn't spoken to me either. I occasionally see her looking at my garden from the street, and I can tell she still doesn't fully understand why I won't just let her take whatever she wants. That story is over. Patricia really convinced herself that a visible garden meant a communal garden, and managed to turn theft into a philosophical debate about neighbourly sharing. Some people will reframe their boundary violations as everyone else's moral failing, rather than acknowledge they're simply taking things that don't belong to them. Our next story involves a gym member who apparently thought fitness equipment came with mandatory personal training from whoever happened to be using it nearby. My experience at the gym last week left me questioning whether some people understand the difference between public spaces and personal services. I've been a member of this particular gym for about 2 years now, and I generally go during the early morning hours before work when it's less crowded. I'm not a personal trainer or fitness professional, just someone who enjoys working out and has developed a consistent routine over time. I was in the middle of my usual workout, doing a set of dumbbell exercises on one of the benches in the free weight area. I've always been pretty focused when I exercise, wearing headphones and keeping to myself, unless someone needs to work in on equipment I'm using. It's not that I'm unfriendly, I just prefer to concentrate on my workout and get through my routine efficiently so I can get to work on time. This particular morning, I noticed a guy I'd never seen before, wandering around the weight area, looking somewhat lost. He appeared to be in his 30s, wearing brand new workout clothes that still had the fold creases visible in them. He kept picking up different dumbbells, examining them like he was shopping for furniture, then putting them back down. I figured he was new to the gym and was still getting familiar with the layout and equipment. I finished my set and was resting between exercises when this guy walked directly over to where I was sitting. He stood there for a moment, clearly waiting for me to acknowledge him, so I pulled out one earbud and asked if he needed something. He launched into this explanation about how he'd just joined the gym last week and wasn't really sure what he was doing. He said he'd been watching me work out and could tell that I obviously knew what I was doing based on my form and the way I moved through my exercises. I thanked him for the compliment and told him that the gym staff usually offered a free orientation session for new members where they'd show him how to use the equipment properly. He waved this suggestion away and said he'd rather learn from someone who actually worked out regularly instead of some trainer who was just going to try to sell him additional services. He asked if I could show him a few exercises and maybe explain my routine to him. I was a bit taken aback by the request, but didn't want to be rude to someone who was genuinely trying to learn. I gave him a quick rundown of the exercise I'd been doing, explained the muscle groups it targeted, and showed him the proper form. I figured that would satisfy his curiosity, and he'd move on to explore the rest of the gym on his own. Instead, he asked what exercise I was doing next. When I told him I was moving on to some shoulder work, he said that was perfect because he really needed to work on his shoulders. He positioned himself on the bench next to mine and picked up a set of dumbbells that were clearly too heavy based on the way he was struggling to lift them into position. I suggested he might want to start with lighter weights to focus on form first, and he actually seemed grateful for the advice, switching to a more appropriate weight. The problem was that he didn't leave after that. He stayed right next to me, mimicking every exercise I did and asking constant questions about each movement. How many sets was I doing? How long should he rest between sets? Was he doing the movement correctly? Should he feel it in this specific part of his shoulder, or was he doing something wrong? The questions were endless and made it impossible for me to maintain any kind of workout flow. I tried to politely explain that I really needed to focus on my own workout and couldn't provide ongoing instruction, but he seemed hurt by this. He said he thought gym culture was supposed to be about people helping each other and supporting each other's fitness journeys. He mentioned that he'd seen videos online of people working out together and spotting each other, and he thought that's how gyms normally operated. I clarified that while people do sometimes work out with partners or friends, that's usually a pre-arranged situation between people who know each other. Random gym members weren't obligated to provide coaching or companionship to other random members. I suggested again that he really should take advantage of the complimentary training session the gym offered, or even consider hiring a personal trainer for a few sessions to learn the basics. He said personal trainers were too expensive, and he didn't see why he should pay someone when there were clearly knowledgeable people already at the gym who could help him. He pointed out that I was already there working out anyway, so it wasn't like helping him was taking me out of my way or costing me anything. He said he'd even be happy to work out on the same schedule I did, so we could be regular workout partners. I tried to explain that I preferred to work out alone, and that my early morning gym time was kind of a meditative experience for me. I told him it wasn't personal, but I really valued that solo time to focus on my fitness goals without distractions. He seemed to interpret this as some kind of challenge to win me over rather than a clear boundary I was trying to establish. Over the next week, he showed up at the gym every single morning at the same time I did. He'd find me wherever I was in the gym and set up nearby to do his workout. He started bringing a notebook where he'd write down everything I did, creating what was essentially a log of my entire routine. He'd note which machines I used, how much weight I lifted, how many reps and sets I completed, and even how long I rested between exercises. At first, I tried just ignoring him and hoping he'd get bored and find someone else to shadow, but he seemed to interpret my silence as acceptance of this arrangement. He started offering unsolicited commentary on my form, pointing out when he thought I wasn't going deep enough on squats, or suggesting that I might want to try a slightly different grip on certain exercises. This was particularly frustrating because I'd been working out consistently for years and had developed techniques that worked well for my body and goals. The situation reached a breaking point when he started correcting other people in the gym based on things he claimed I'd taught him. I overheard him telling a woman that she was doing lap pull-downs wrong, because that's not how his workout mentor did them. The woman looked confused and asked who his mentor was, and he pointed directly at me across the gym. She looked over at me with this expression that clearly asked whether I was actually involved in this situation or if this guy was just weird. I walked over and apologised to her, explaining that I'd never agreed to mentor anyone and that this person had basically assigned himself as my apprentice without my consent. She laughed it off and said she'd figured something was odd about the situation, but the whole thing was embarrassing for me. I'd always tried to be a respectful gym member who minded my own business, and now I had someone essentially using my name to give fitness advice to strangers. I decided I needed to have a direct conversation with this guy about boundaries. I found him by the water fountain and told him clearly that while I appreciated his enthusiasm for fitness, I wasn't comfortable with him shadowing my workouts, copying my routine, or telling people I was his mentor. I explained that everyone at the gym paid the same membership fee, and that didn't include unlimited access to other members' time and attention. He seemed genuinely shocked by what I was saying. He told me he thought we'd developed a friendship over the past week, and that he considered me his gym buddy. He said he'd been telling his wife about his new workout friend and how much he was learning from our sessions together. The fact that he'd characterised our non-consensual interactions as friendship and collaborative sessions was deeply concerning to me. I had to explicitly state that we were not friends, we were not workout buddies, and we definitely weren't having training sessions together. I told him that I'd been clear from the beginning that I preferred to work out alone, and his continued presence, despite my expressed preferences, was making me uncomfortable enough that I was considering changing my gym schedule entirely. He got defensive at that point and said I was being unnecessarily hostile to someone who just wanted to improve their health. He accused me of being elitist about fitness and suggested that experienced gym members had a responsibility to help newcomers feel welcome and supported. He said if I wasn't willing to be part of a positive gym community, maybe I was the one who should find a different place to work out. I ended up speaking with the gym management about the situation. I explained that another member had been following me around despite my requests for space, copying my workouts and claiming to other members that I was providing him with training. The manager was very understanding and said they'd address it with him. Apparently, after they spoke with him, he tried to argue that the gym should require experienced members to mentor new members as part of their membership agreement, which obviously wasn't a thing. The manager made it clear to him that harassing other members was grounds for membership termination, and that he needed to either work out independently or utilise the actual training services the gym offered. For a few days after that, he continued coming to the gym, but would glare at me from across the room, like I'd personally wronged him by not wanting to be his unpaid personal trainer. Eventually, I stopped seeing him at the gym entirely. I heard from one of the front desk staff that he'd cancelled his membership and left a negative review online, complaining about the unfriendly atmosphere and lack of community support. In his review, he specifically mentioned that experienced members refused to share their knowledge with beginners and that the gym fostered an unwelcoming environment for people new to fitness. The whole experience taught me that some people genuinely don't understand that sharing a space with someone doesn't mean you're obligated to share your time, attention, or expertise with them. The gym is a public accommodation in the sense that anyone who pays can use it, but that doesn't make every person in that space a public resource available for unlimited consultation. What bothered me most wasn't even the time he took up or the disruption to my routine, though both of those things were frustrating. It was the fundamental inability or unwillingness to respect a clearly stated boundary. I told him multiple times, in multiple ways, that I wanted to work out alone, and he consistently reframed my boundary as something negotiable or as evidence of my moral failure, rather than as a legitimate personal preference that deserved respect. I've since started varying my gym schedule a bit more, and being even more intentional about signalling that I'm not available for interaction. I keep both earbuds in, avoid eye contact, and move quickly between exercises. It's unfortunate that I feel like I need to be less approachable to avoid similar situations, but apparently some people interpret basic politeness as an invitation to unlimited access. That story's over. This guy really created an entire mentorship narrative in his head and couldn't comprehend that sharing physical space with someone at a gym doesn't mean they've agreed to become your personal trainer and workout companion. Some people fundamentally misunderstand the difference between public spaces, where anyone can be present, and personal relationships that require mutual consent and agreement. Our next story involves a wedding guest who apparently thought the open bar policy extended to taking home bottles of premium liquor for personal consumption. My cousin's wedding last month turned into an absolute disaster thanks to one guest who decided that open bar meant something completely different than what the rest of us understood. I've been to plenty of weddings in my life, and I thought I'd seen every possible way someone could behave inappropriately at these events, but this situation managed to surprise even me with its sheer audacity. My cousin Rebecca got married to her longtime boyfriend in this beautiful venue overlooking the water. They'd been planning the wedding for over a year and had put an enormous amount of thought and money into making sure everything was perfect. The ceremony was lovely, emotional in all the right ways, and the reception space was decorated gorgeously with flowers and lights everywhere. They'd hired an excellent caterer and had splurged on a premium open bar package that included top-shelf liquor, craft cocktails, and a selection of nice wines. The open bar was one of those generous touches that Rebecca and her husband really wanted to provide for their guests. They knew that bar tabs at weddings could get expensive for attendees, and they wanted everyone to be able to celebrate without worrying about the cost of drinks. The bartenders were professional, the selection was impressive, and everything seemed to be running smoothly for the first few hours of the reception. I noticed the problem starting around the time dinner was wrapping up and people were beginning to move around more freely. There was this guy, mid-40s maybe, who I later learned was a co-worker of Rebecca's husband. His name was Douglas, and he'd apparently been invited more out of professional obligation than actual friendship. Throughout dinner, I'd noticed he was drinking pretty steadily, making multiple trips to the bar between courses. But lots of people drink at weddings, so it didn't initially stand out as particularly concerning. What did start to stand out was the way Douglas was interacting with the bartenders. Most people would walk up, order a drink, maybe chat briefly while it was being made, and then return to their table or join conversations with other guests. Douglas was camping out at the bar, ordering drinks in rapid succession, and I noticed he seemed to be asking the bartenders a lot of questions about the various bottles behind them. At one point, I saw him actually walk behind the bar, which the bartender quickly but politely redirected him away from. The reception continued with toasts and the first dance, all the traditional wedding activities that everyone was there to witness and celebrate. I was chatting with some relatives near the dance floor when I noticed Douglas walking past carrying what looked like a full bottle of whiskey under his jacket. It was poorly concealed, with the neck of the bottle clearly visible, and he was moving in this exaggerated casual way that people do when they're trying very hard to look like they're not doing anything wrong. I wasn't sure if I'd actually seen what I thought I'd seen, so I mentioned it to my sister, who was standing next to me. She said she'd noticed him making several trips out to the parking lot throughout the evening, and had assumed he was just stepping outside for fresh air or phone calls. We decided to keep an eye on the situation to see if anything else unusual happened. About 20 minutes later, Douglas made another appearance, this time even less subtle about what he was doing. He walked up to the bar, waited until both bartenders were busy making drinks for other guests, and then quickly grabbed 2 bottles of premium vodka from the display shelf. He tucked them under his arms like he was carrying footballs and headed toward the exit. The bartenders noticed immediately and called out to him, but he just waved and kept walking like he thought they were saying goodbye. One of the bartenders came out from behind the bar and followed Douglas toward the parking lot. My sister and I, along with a few other guests who'd witnessed this, followed at a distance because the whole situation was so bizarre we couldn't quite believe what we were seeing. The bartender caught up with Douglas at his car, where we could see he already had the trunk open and was attempting to load the bottles inside alongside what appeared to be several other bottles of liquor he'd apparently already taken. The bartender was trying to explain that he couldn't take bottles from the bar, that the open bar meant free drinks that were poured and served by the bartenders, not that guests could help themselves to entire bottles of alcohol. Douglas seemed genuinely confused by this distinction. From what we could overhear, he was arguing that if the bar was open and free, then technically everything at the bar should be available for guests to take. He said he was just trying to make the most of what was being offered and didn't understand why there was suddenly a problem. The bartender was remarkably patient given the circumstances. He explained that the wedding couple had paid for a service that included unlimited drinks prepared by professional bartenders, not for guests to raid the inventory and take home bottles worth hundreds of dollars each. Douglas kept insisting that nobody had explicitly told him he couldn't take bottles, and without that specific rule being stated, he'd assumed it was acceptable. By this point, Rebecca's new husband had been alerted to the situation and came out to the parking lot to see what was happening. You could see the realization dawn on his face as he looked into Douglas's trunk and saw at least 6 or 7 bottles of premium liquor sitting there. These weren't cheap bottles either. We're talking expensive single malt scotch, top shelf tequila, aged rum, the kinds of bottles that cost $70 to $100 or more each. Rebecca's husband tried to stay calm and diplomatic. He explained to Douglas that there seemed to be a misunderstanding about what the open bar meant, and he'd need to return all the bottles he'd taken. Douglas's response was to get defensive and slightly belligerent. He started talking about how he'd driven 2 hours to attend this wedding, had brought a gift, and was just trying to enjoy the hospitality that was being offered. He made it sound like taking half the bar's inventory home was somehow a reasonable interpretation of wedding hospitality. The situation attracted more attention as other guests noticed the commotion in the parking lot. Rebecca eventually came out as well, still in her wedding dress, which was absolutely not how she should have been spending her reception. She looked devastated when she saw what was happening. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life, and instead she was dealing with a guest who was essentially stealing from her wedding. Douglas seemed to finally grasp that he'd crossed a serious line when he saw Rebecca's expression. He started backtracking, claiming he'd been joking and was just seeing how many bottles he could get to his car before someone noticed. He tried to frame the entire thing as a prank or social experiment, which was obviously ridiculous given that he'd been methodically loading bottles into his trunk for over an hour at that point. Rebecca's husband was done being diplomatic. He told Douglas that he needed to return every single bottle immediately, and then he needed to leave the wedding. Douglas protested that he hadn't technically done anything illegal since the bar was offered as free and open to guests. Someone pointed out that theft was indeed illegal, regardless of whether the bar was complimentary, and that taking full bottles of liquor without permission absolutely qualified as theft. Douglas finally started removing bottles from his trunk and handing them back to the bartender, but he was clearly resentful about it. He kept muttering about how this was all a misunderstanding and how unfair it was to kick him out over what he still characterised as a simple mistake. As he was unloading the bottles, it became clear that he'd taken even more than we'd initially realised. There were bottles of wine, champagne, even some of the specialty liqueurs that had been behind the bar for making craft cocktails. The venue manager had been called at some point during all this, and she arrived looking absolutely furious. Apparently, this wasn't the first time someone had tried to steal from a wedding bar at her venue, but it was definitely the most blatant case she'd dealt with. She was checking the bottles Douglas returned against the inventory list to make sure everything was accounted for, and she discovered that one very expensive bottle of scotch was missing. Douglas initially claimed he didn't know anything about any scotch, but when the venue manager mentioned they had security cameras in the parking lot, he suddenly remembered that maybe he'd set one bottle aside somewhere. He retrieved it from the front seat of his car, where he'd apparently stashed it separately from the others, perhaps hoping it wouldn't be noticed in the trunk inventory. Once all the bottles were returned and accounted for, the venue manager banned Douglas from the property and told him if he ever tried to attend another event there, the police would be called immediately. Rebecca's husband informed Douglas that their professional relationship was going to be extremely awkward going forward, and Douglas would be wise to start looking for employment elsewhere, because this incident was going to be reported to their supervisor. Douglas finally left, but not before trying one more time to explain that he'd simply misunderstood what open bar meant and that everyone was overreacting. He said that in his culture, when something is offered freely, it's considered rude not to take full advantage of the generosity being shown. Someone pointed out that there's no culture on earth where stealing bottles of premium liquor from a wedding reception is considered appropriate behaviour, and that he needed to stop trying to justify what he'd done. The rest of the reception continued after Douglas left, but the energy had definitely changed. People were talking about what had happened, the bartenders were understandably more vigilant about watching their inventory, and Rebecca and her husband had lost a chunk of their wedding night dealing with this absurd situation. They tried to get back into the celebratory mood, and the DJ did his best to get people back on the dance floor, but there was this underlying awareness that something really inappropriate had occurred. What bothered me most about the whole incident wasn't even the attempted theft itself, though that was certainly bad enough. It was Douglas's complete inability to understand why what he'd done was wrong. Even after being caught with a trunk full of stolen liquor, even after seeing how upset the bride and groom were, even after being banned from the venue and threatened with professional consequences, he still seemed to genuinely believe that he'd done nothing more than push the boundaries of acceptable behaviour slightly too far. The wedding couple later found out from other co-workers that Douglas had a reputation for this kind of thing. Apparently he'd been known to take excessive amounts of food from catered office events, had been caught removing supplies from the office supply closet for personal use, and generally operated with this mentality that anything provided in a professional or social setting was fair game for him to take as much as he wanted. The wedding incident was just the most extreme version of a pattern of behaviour he'd been exhibiting for years. Rebecca and her husband had to file a report with the venue about the incident for insurance purposes, even though all the bottles were ultimately returned. The venue ended up comping a portion of their bar bill because of the disruption and stress the situation had caused, which was a nice gesture, but didn't really make up for having their wedding reception derailed by someone's bizarre interpretation of open bar etiquette. That story is over. Douglas really convinced himself that open bar meant he could load his trunk with premium liquor like he was shopping during a going out of business sale, and even when caught couldn't comprehend why everyone considered his behaviour theft rather than enthusiastic participation. Some people will perform extraordinary mental gymnastics to avoid acknowledging that their behaviour crosses basic ethical boundaries, preferring instead to reframe theft as cultural misunderstanding or aggressive hospitality acceptance. Our next story involves a woman at a coffee shop who apparently believed that laptop users were obligated to provide technical support to anyone who asked. I had the strangest encounter at my usual coffee shop yesterday that left me wondering how some people navigate through daily life with such wildly incorrect assumptions about social obligations. I've been working remotely for about 3 years now, and I've developed this routine where I spend my afternoons at a local coffee shop that has decent Wi-Fi, comfortable seating, and makes an excellent cappuccino. It's become my unofficial office, and the staff knows me well enough that they usually start making my drink as soon as they see me walk through the door. Yesterday afternoon, I settled into my favourite corner table with my laptop, coffee, and headphones to work on a project that had a tight deadline. I was deep into reviewing some complicated spreadsheets when I felt someone standing next to my table. I looked up to find a woman hovering there with her own laptop clutched against her chest, staring at me expectantly. She appeared to be somewhere in her 50s, wearing a business suit that suggested she was probably on a break from work at one of the nearby office buildings. I pulled out one earbud and asked if I could help her with something, assuming maybe she needed to borrow the chair at my table, or wanted to know if the outlet near me was working. Instead, she asked if I was good with computers. The question caught me off guard because it was so vague, and her tone suggested she was leading up to asking for something significant. I told her I was reasonably competent with technology, but wasn't an IT professional or anything like that. She immediately launched into this explanation about how her laptop had been running slowly all morning, and she'd noticed I seemed to be working efficiently on mine, so she figured I must know what I was doing with computers. She asked if I could take a quick look at her laptop and figure out what was wrong with it. She said it would probably only take a few minutes and she'd really appreciate the help. I was somewhat stunned by the request. This was a complete stranger asking me to provide free technical support in the middle of my workday, apparently based solely on the fact that I was using a laptop in a public space. I politely explained that I was actually in the middle of working on something with a deadline and wouldn't be able to help her troubleshoot her computer issues. I suggested she might want to contact her company's IT department or take her laptop to a repair shop if she was having technical problems. She looked disappointed and slightly offended by my response. She said she'd just seen me sitting there and assumed I was just browsing the internet or doing something casual since I was at a coffee shop instead of an office. She made this comment about how people who work in coffee shops always seem to have plenty of time to chat and take breaks, so she didn't think asking for a few minutes of help would be such an imposition. I tried to explain that many people use coffee shops as remote workspaces and are actually doing legitimate work, not just casually surfing the web. I told her that I had actual deadlines and projects I needed to focus on, which is why I couldn't stop what I was doing to troubleshoot her laptop. She seemed skeptical about this explanation, like she didn't quite believe that real work could be accomplished in a coffee shop environment. She then tried a different approach, suggesting that maybe I could just tell her what might be wrong without actually looking at her computer. She described symptoms that were incredibly vague, things like her laptop being slow and programs taking a long time to open. She asked if I had any quick tips or simple fixes she could try. I gave her the most generic advice I could think of, suggesting she try restarting her laptop, checking for software updates, and making sure she wasn't running too many programs simultaneously. This apparently wasn't the kind of help she was looking for. She said she'd already tried turning it off and on again, and that hadn't solved anything. She insisted there must be something more technical wrong with it, and that someone with computer knowledge would be able to identify the problem immediately. She made another appeal for me to just take a quick look, emphasizing again that it would only take a minute, and she was really struggling with her slow laptop. I remained firm in my refusal, reiterating that I needed to focus on my own work. She stood there for another moment, seeming to debate whether to continue pressing the issue, before finally asking if there was anyone else in the coffee shop who might be able to help her. She gestured around the room at the other patrons, several of whom were also working on laptops. I told her I had no idea what other people's technical skills were, or whether they'd be willing to help, but that she was welcome to ask them herself. What happened next was somewhat surreal. She actually went around to different tables asking laptop users if they could help fix her computer. I watched as she approached at least 4 or 5 different people with the same request. Most of them gave her responses similar to mine, politely declining and explaining they were busy with their own work. One person actually did try to help her, spending about 10 minutes asking questions about her laptop and suggesting various things to try, but ultimately couldn't solve whatever problem she was experiencing. After being turned down by multiple people, she came back to my table. She seemed frustrated and asked why everyone in the coffee shop was being so unhelpful. She said she couldn't understand why people who clearly had computer skills weren't willing to spend a few minutes helping someone who was struggling. She made this comment about how society had become so individualistic and people weren't willing to help their neighbours anymore. I pointed out that helping neighbours was different from providing free technical support to random strangers in coffee shops. I explained that the people she'd approached were all trying to work or study or handle their own tasks, and interrupting them to demand tech support wasn't really a reasonable request. She insisted it wasn't demanding, it was just asking for help, and she couldn't see why that was such a problem. She went on to say that she'd grown up in a time when people were more community-oriented and would readily help each other with problems. She said that if someone had asked her for help with something she knew how to do, she'd drop whatever she was doing to assist them because that's what good people do. I suggested that there was a difference between occasionally helping someone in an emergency and being expected to provide professional services for free to anyone who asked. This seemed to really bother her. She asked what made computer help a professional service rather than just a neighbourly favour. She pointed out that I wasn't charging money to work on my laptop, so clearly my time wasn't that valuable if I was willing to sit in a coffee shop. The implication seemed to be that if I was working somewhere casual rather than in a traditional office, my work couldn't be that important or time sensitive. I tried one more time to explain that location doesn't determine the legitimacy or urgency of someone's work. I told her that I had actual paying work to complete, and that's what I needed to focus my time and attention on, not troubleshooting computer problems for strangers. She finally seemed to accept that she wasn't going to get help from me, but she made sure to express her disappointment in what she characterised as my unwillingness to be part of a helpful community. Before she left my table, she asked if I could at least recommend someone who could help her with computer issues. I suggested she try searching online for local computer repair services or contact the manufacturer's support line if her laptop was still under warranty. She said she didn't want to pay for technical support when there were clearly people right here in this coffee shop who had the knowledge to help her for free. The entitlement in that statement was remarkable. This assumption that strangers should provide their expertise and time at no cost simply because they happen to be in the same physical space. She eventually gave up and left the coffee shop, but not before making some passive-aggressive comments, loud enough for several people to hear about how disappointing it was that nobody was willing to help someone in need. A few of the other laptop users caught my eye, and we exchanged these knowing looks, a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity we'd all just witnessed. The barista came over to my table a few minutes later and apologised for the disruption. Apparently, the woman had complained to the staff on her way out, suggesting that the coffee shop attracted selfish customers who weren't willing to help fellow patrons. The barista assured me that they understood people came there to work and weren't obligated to provide services to other customers. He mentioned that they occasionally got people who seemed to think coffee shops were community centres where everyone should be available to help with various problems. What struck me most about the interaction was this fundamental misunderstanding about what constitutes reasonable requests versus impositions. This woman genuinely seemed to believe that because we were sharing public space and I had visible technical competence, I somehow owed her my time and expertise. She couldn't or wouldn't distinguish between casual neighbourly help and requesting professional services for free. The incident also highlighted how some people view remote workers or anyone working outside traditional office spaces. There's this assumption that if you're not sitting in a corporate office or wearing business attire, your work must not be legitimate or urgent. The idea that someone could be doing important, deadline-driven work while sitting in jeans at a coffee shop seemed to be outside her framework for understanding how modern work operates. I found myself thinking about how this mentality must play out in other areas of her life. Does she approach people working on their cars and demand free mechanical advice? Does she stop lawyers at the grocery store and ask for legal counsel? Does she interrupt doctors at restaurants to describe her symptoms? Or is there something specific about technology and computer work that people think should be freely available to anyone who asks? The whole experience made me more conscious of the boundaries I set and the explanations I give when declining requests. I didn't owe this woman a detailed justification for why I couldn't help her, but I found myself providing one anyway, trying to make her understand that my refusal wasn't personal or mean-spirited. In retrospect, a simple no should have been sufficient. But there's this social pressure to soften rejections and explain yourself, especially when someone is framing their request as a simple favour rather than an unreasonable demand. I've continued going to the same coffee shop for my afternoon work sessions, though I'm now slightly more aware of people approaching my table. I've developed this practiced response for when someone starts to ask about technical issues, a polite but firm explanation that I'm not available to provide tech support. Most people accept this gracefully, but I suspect that woman wasn't the only person who fundamentally misunderstands what working in public spaces means, or what obligations we have to strangers who happen to be nearby. That story is over. This woman really toured a coffee shop, asking every laptop user for free technical support, and then characterised their refusals as evidence of society's decline, unable to grasp that strangers working in public spaces aren't obligated to drop everything and solve her computer problems. Some people genuinely cannot distinguish between reasonable requests for help and demanding unpaid professional services from anyone who appears competent. Our next story involves a parking lot encounter that revealed just how creatively some people can justify taking whatever they want from unlocked vehicles. I had an experience in a grocery store parking lot 3 weeks ago that still has me shaking my head in disbelief. I've lived in the same suburban area for most of my adult life, and while it's not the kind of place where you leave your doors unlocked at night, it's generally pretty safe, and you don't expect to deal with brazen theft in broad daylight. That assumption got thoroughly challenged on what should have been a routine Saturday afternoon shopping trip. I'd gone to the grocery store to pick up supplies for a dinner party I was hosting that evening. It was one of those ambitious cooking projects where I needed a bunch of specific ingredients, so I knew I'd be in the store for at least 30 or 40 minutes. I parked in my usual area toward the back of the lot, where there's more space and less risk of door dings from other cars. I grabbed my reusable shopping bags from the trunk and headed inside, mentally running through my list and trying to remember if I'd written down everything I needed. The shopping itself was uneventful. Just the usual weekend crowd and the mild frustration of the store being out of one specific herb I needed, forcing me to adjust my menu slightly. I checked out, loaded everything into my cart, and headed back out to the parking lot. As I approached my car, I noticed someone standing at the passenger side with the door open. My first thought was that I'd somehow left my car unlocked, which would have been unusual for me, but not impossible if I'd been distracted when I arrived. As I got closer, I realised this wasn't someone checking to see if the car was unlocked or looking for loose change. This was a woman, probably in her late 30s, actively going through my glove compartment. She had papers spread out on the passenger seat and was examining them one by one like she was conducting some kind of inventory. My registration, insurance card, the car manual, various receipts I'd stuffed in there over the months, all of it was laid out while she sorted through everything. I stopped pushing my cart and just stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. It was such a bizarre scene that my brain needed a few seconds to catch up with reality. This person wasn't trying to be sneaky or quick about what she was doing. She was going through my belongings methodically and unhurriedly, as if she had every right to be there. I finally found my voice and called out to ask what she was doing in my car. She looked up, saw me standing there with my grocery cart, and didn't seem particularly concerned or guilty about being caught. She held up my insurance card and said she was just checking to see if my policy was current. She explained this like it was a perfectly normal and reasonable thing to be doing, like she was some kind of parking lot insurance inspector making routine verification checks. I walked up to my car and told her she needed to get out immediately and explain why she was going through my personal documents. She set down the insurance card and started gathering the papers back into a pile, but she wasn't moving with any sense of urgency. She said she'd noticed my car was unlocked when she walked past, and she thought she should check to make sure everything was in order. She claimed she was doing me a favour by verifying that I had proper documentation in case I got pulled over. The explanation was so absurd that I actually asked her to repeat it because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She elaborated that she made it a practice to check unlocked cars in parking lots to ensure people had their important papers properly stored. She said she'd found numerous vehicles over the years where people were missing crucial documents, and she'd been able to alert them to the problem before they got in trouble with law enforcement. I told her that going through someone's car without permission was illegal regardless of her stated intentions. I pointed out that this was clearly an invasion of privacy and could easily be considered attempted theft. She seemed genuinely offended by the accusation. She insisted she wasn't stealing anything. She was performing a public service by checking on vehicle documentation. She said if I'd kept my car locked like I was supposed to, this wouldn't be an issue. So really, it was my own fault for leaving it accessible. I was fairly certain I had locked my car, but at this point, I was more concerned with getting this person away from my vehicle than debating the locked versus unlocked status. I asked her to step away from my car and leave my belongings alone. She finally did close the passenger door, but she didn't leave. Instead, she started telling me about all the problems she'd discovered in other people's cars over the years. Expired registrations, outdated insurance cards, missing owners' manuals. Apparently she had a whole catalogue of automotive document deficiencies she'd uncovered through her unauthorised inspections. She mentioned that just last week she'd found a car with registration that had expired 2 months prior, and she'd left a note on the windshield alerting the owner to renew it immediately. She seemed to expect praise or gratitude for these interventions, like she was providing some valuable community service rather than committing repeated acts of trespassing and invasion of privacy. I started loading my groceries into the trunk while keeping an eye on her, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. She didn't. She moved around to the driver's side of my car and tried the door handle. I'd apparently locked that door, even if the passenger side had somehow been left open. She commented that it was inconsistent security to lock one door but not the other, and that I really should be more careful about these things. At this point, I was getting genuinely concerned about this woman's behaviour. This wasn't just someone being nosy or making poor judgment calls. This was someone with a completely warped understanding of boundaries and property rights. I pulled out my phone and told her I was calling the police if she didn't leave immediately. She asked why I was being so hostile when she was trying to help me. She said most people appreciated her vigilance, and that I was being unnecessarily defensive about a simple documentation check. I started dialing while she continued talking. She was explaining her methodology for determining which cars to check, something about looking for signs of disorganisation or neglect that might indicate the owner wasn't properly maintaining their paperwork. She said my car had seemed like a good candidate because I had some visible clutter in the back seat. Apparently, a few reusable shopping bags and a jacket constituted evidence that I wasn't responsible enough to keep proper documentation. When she realised I was actually calling the police, she finally started backing away from my car. She said I was overreacting and that she'd just been trying to help. She mentioned that she'd never had anyone call the police on her before, though I found that hard to believe given that she'd admitted to going through multiple vehicles. Either she was lying about the frequency of her car inspections, or she'd been lucky enough to avoid getting caught until now. A store security guard had apparently noticed the situation unfolding and came over to ask if everything was okay. I explained that this woman had been going through my car without permission and was claiming she was checking my vehicle documents. The security guard asked her to provide identification, which she refused to do. She said she hadn't done anything wrong and therefore didn't need to identify herself. The security guard asked her to leave the parking lot. She argued that it was a public parking lot and she had as much right to be there as anyone else. The security guard clarified that it was actually private property belonging to the grocery store, and they had the right to ask anyone to leave. She seemed surprised by this information, like she genuinely believed parking lots were public spaces where normal rules didn't apply. While we were waiting for the police to arrive, the woman tried several more times to justify her actions. She talked about community responsibility and looking out for one another. She said that in her neighbourhood growing up, people would check on each other's properties and make sure everything was secure. She seemed to think that going through strangers' cars fell under this umbrella of neighbourly vigilance. When the police officers arrived, they asked both of us to explain what had happened. I described finding her going through my glove compartment and her subsequent explanation about checking vehicle documents. She confirmed this version of events, but framed it as a misunderstanding about her intentions. She told the officers she was simply trying to help ensure vehicles in the parking lot were properly documented and maintained. The officers explained to her that entering someone's vehicle without permission, even if unlocked, could be considered criminal trespass. They asked if she'd taken anything from my car, and she insisted she hadn't. She'd only been looking. I checked my glove compartment and center console more thoroughly while they talked to her, and as far as I could tell, nothing was actually missing. All my documents were there, along with the random accumulation of napkins, hand sanitizer, and other miscellaneous items I kept in the car. One of the officers asked her how many other vehicles she'd entered to perform these documentation checks. She hesitated before answering, clearly realising that admitting to a pattern of this behaviour might not help her case. She said she'd probably checked a few dozen cars over the past couple of years whenever she noticed vehicles that appeared to be unlocked. The officer explained that she'd potentially committed dozens of acts of criminal trespass, and that she was lucky more people hadn't reported her to police. She was given a citation and a warning that any future reports of her entering vehicles would result in arrest. The officers also suggested she might benefit from speaking with someone about why she felt compelled to go through other people's cars. She seemed insulted by the implication that her behaviour was abnormal, insisting again that she was just trying to be helpful and that society would be better off if more people took initiative to ensure their neighbours were following proper vehicle documentation procedures. After she finally left and the police had taken my statement, I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. The security guard came back over and mentioned that they actually had a few reports over the past months about someone going through cars in their parking lot, but they'd never been able to identify who was doing it. Apparently, my encounter wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern this woman had been engaged in for quite some time. The whole experience left me much more paranoid about locking my car, even though I remained fairly certain I had locked it before going into the store. I started obsessively checking door handles multiple times whenever I parked anywhere. I also found myself wondering how many times this woman had gone through my car previously without me knowing. Had she been conducting her unauthorized inspections every time I shopped at this grocery store? How many other people's vehicles had she rifled through while they were inside buying groceries? What bothered me most wasn't even the invasion of privacy, though that was certainly disturbing. It was the absolute conviction she had that her behaviour was not only acceptable, but actually commendable. She'd created this entire framework in her mind where going through strangers' cars was a form of community service. She couldn't or wouldn't recognise that what she was doing was fundamentally wrong, no matter how many times it was explained to her by me, the security guard, or the police officers. I heard later from the store manager that they'd banned her from the property and had circulated her description to other nearby shopping centres. Apparently, after being caught at this location, she'd simply moved on to other parking lots to continue her vehicle documentation crusade. It took several more incidents and complaints before she finally seemed to stop, though I have no idea if she actually understood why her behaviour was problematic, or if she just got tired of dealing with angry car owners and police involvement. That story's over. This woman constructed an elaborate justification for repeatedly trespassing into strangers' vehicles, genuinely believing her unauthorised documentation inspections were a valuable community service rather than serial invasions of privacy. Some people build such convincing narratives around their inappropriate behaviour that they become immune to recognising how profoundly they're violating basic social and legal boundaries. Our next story involves a hotel pool incident that demonstrated how some people believe public amenities come with the right to reorganise other guest belongings to suit their preferences. I just got back from what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway that turned into one of the most bizarre confrontations I've ever experienced. My partner and I had booked a nice hotel about 2 hours from where we live, one of those places with a decent spa, an indoor pool, and enough amenities to justify not leaving the property for the entire weekend. We'd both been working insane hours for the past few months and desperately needed some downtime to decompress and reconnect. Saturday afternoon, we decided to spend some time at the hotel pool. It wasn't a huge pool, maybe 25 feet long, but it was in this beautiful glass-enclosed atrium with plants everywhere and plenty of lounge chairs scattered around the perimeter. When we arrived around 2 p.m, there were only a few other people there, a couple reading books on the far side, and a family with young kids playing in the shallow end. We found 2 lounge chairs near the deep end, set down our towels, books, and the bag with our sunscreen and water bottles, then got in the pool to swim for a while. We were in the water for maybe 20 minutes, just floating and talking and enjoying not having anywhere we needed to be. When we got out and walked back to our lounge chairs, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Our towels had been moved from the chairs and were now folded neatly on the ground. Our books were stacked on top of the towels, and the bag with our belongings had been placed beside the pile. Someone had completely cleared our chairs and rearranged all our stuff. Standing near the chairs was a woman, probably in her 60s, wearing a floral one-piece swimsuit and a large sun hat despite being indoors. She was in the process of spreading out her own towel on one of the chairs we'd been occupying. She had this whole setup with her: a rolling cooler, several magazines, what looks like a portable speaker, and enough pool accessories to stock a small beach shop. I walked over and asked if she'd moved our things from these chairs. She glanced at the pile on the ground and then back at me with a pleasant smile that suggested she didn't see any problem with what she'd done. She explained that when she'd arrived at the pool, these were the only chairs with optimal sun exposure, and since nobody had been sitting in them, she'd assumed they were available. She'd kindly folded our towels for us and set everything aside so we could find it easily. I pointed out that our belongings had been on those chairs, which should have made it obvious they were occupied. The universal rule at pools and beaches everywhere is that if someone's stuff is on a chair, that chair is taken. She waved off this explanation and said she didn't subscribe to the practice of reserving chairs with towels when nobody was actually using them. She said it was inefficient and selfish for people to claim chairs they weren't actively sitting in, especially when other guests might want to use that specific location. My partner, who's generally more diplomatic than I am, suggested that maybe we could find different chairs and this woman could keep the ones she'd already set up on. There were probably a dozen other empty chairs around the pool, though admittedly none in quite the same spot as the ones we'd originally chosen. The woman immediately agreed this was a good solution and thanked us for being so understanding about the situation. I was less willing to just walk away. Something about her complete lack of acknowledgement that she'd done anything wrong really bothered me. I said that we'd actually like to have our original chairs back since we'd been there first and had already settled in before going for a swim. The woman's pleasant expression faltered slightly. She said that seemed unreasonable since she'd already moved all her belongings onto the chairs and had her entire afternoon setup arranged the way she wanted it. She suggested that if the chair location was really that important to me, I should have stayed sitting in it rather than getting in the pool. She made this comment about how you can't expect to hold a spot indefinitely when you're not actively occupying it. I told her we'd been gone for less than half an hour, and our belongings had clearly indicated the chairs were in use. She countered that 30 minutes was actually quite a long time to leave chairs unattended, and that pool etiquette required people to remain in close proximity to any chairs they wanted to claim. At this point, a hotel staff member who managed the pool area happened to walk through on their rounds. I flagged them down and explained the situation, that we'd been using these chairs, had gone swimming for a short time, and had returned to find this woman had moved all our belongings and taken over the chairs. The staff member, a young guy who looked like he really didn't want to be mediating pool chair disputes on a Saturday afternoon, asked the woman if she'd moved other guests' belongings from the chairs. She confirmed that she had, but quickly added her justification about the chairs being unattended and her right to use facilities that weren't being actively occupied. The staff member explained with admirable patience that the hotel's policy was that guests could reserve chairs with their belongings while they swam or went to get food or used the restroom. Moving other guests' items without permission wasn't appropriate. The woman seemed genuinely shocked by this information. She said that policy didn't make any sense from an efficiency standpoint. She started explaining her reasoning in detail, going into this whole thing about optimal resource allocation and how allowing people to reserve chairs they weren't using created artificial scarcity. She mentioned that she'd been coming to hotels for decades and had never heard of such a policy before. The staff member assured her that this was indeed standard practice at most hotels and that she needed to return the chairs to us and find her own seating elsewhere. She stood there for a long moment, apparently trying to decide whether to argue further or comply. Finally, she began gathering her belongings with exaggerated slowness, making it very clear through her body language that she felt this was a grave injustice. She was muttering under her breath about entitled millennials, which was particularly amusing since my partner and I are both in our mid-30s and this complaint seemed wildly misapplied to the situation. As she was packing up her rolling cooler, she turned to the staff member and asked where she was supposed to sit now that we were forcing her out of the only acceptable location. The staff member gestured around the pool area at the many empty chairs and suggested she choose any of them. She said none of those chairs had the right sun angle and that we were essentially ruining her afternoon by insisting on these particular spots. I couldn't help but point out that she'd ruined our afternoon first by moving our belongings without permission. She acted like this was a completely different situation. She explained that when she'd moved our things, she'd done it carefully and respectfully, folding everything neatly. She seemed to think the manner in which she'd displaced us somehow made it acceptable, as if being organised about taking someone's chairs was fundamentally different from rudely stealing them. She eventually moved to a chair on the opposite side of the pool, but she made sure we all knew she was unhappy about it. She kept looking over at us and shaking her head, occasionally making comments to other pool guests about how some people were so rigid about pool seating. I noticed her trying to engage the family, with small children, in a conversation about our alleged selfishness, but they wisely declined to get involved in whatever drama was unfolding. My partner and I tried to settle back into our afternoon, but the relaxing vibe had been thoroughly disrupted. We were both tense and hyper-aware of this woman across the pool, who kept staring at us like we'd personally victimised her. After about 15 minutes, she got up and walked back over to where we were sitting. I thought she might be coming to apologise, or at least acknowledge the situation, but instead she wanted to resume her argument about pool chair efficiency. She launched into this detailed explanation of how hotel pools would function better if people couldn't reserve chairs they weren't actively using. She suggested that there should be a time limit, maybe 5 minutes, where if you left your chair unattended, anyone else could claim it. She said this would encourage people to make better use of the facilities and prevent the artificial scarcity created by chair hoarding. The term chair hoarding was apparently her characterization of the normal practice of placing your towel on a lounge chair before getting in the pool. I told her I wasn't interested in debating pool management theory and just wanted to enjoy my afternoon. She said I was being closed-minded and that if I'd just listened to her reasoning, I'd understand why her approach was superior. She actually pulled out her phone and started showing me some kind of article she'd saved about optimal resource distribution in shared spaces. I declined to read it and asked her again to please let us relax in peace. She finally walked away, but not before informing us that she was going to speak with hotel management about their unreasonable chair reservation policy. She said she'd been a loyal customer of this hotel chain for years and had a right to have her concerns heard. My partner and I exchanged glances, both wondering what we'd done to deserve being targeted by someone so intensely committed to reorganising pool furniture protocols. About 30 minutes later, we saw her talking animatedly with someone who appeared to be a manager near the pool entrance. She was gesturing toward us and clearly explaining her version of events. The manager nodded politely, occasionally looking over at where we were sitting. Eventually, the manager approached us and apologised for the disruption to our afternoon. They assured us that the hotel's policy on chair reservations was clearly stated and that we hadn't done anything wrong. The manager mentioned that this guest had apparently been going around the hotel all weekend, trying to reorganise various aspects of the facilities according to her own efficiency standards. She'd already complained about the breakfast buffet layout, suggested a complete restructuring of the fitness centre equipment arrangement, and had submitted a detailed proposal for improving the front desk check-in process. The pool chair situation was just her latest crusade to optimise hotel operations according to her personal theories about resource management. We spent another hour or so at the pool, though the enjoyment had been significantly diminished by the whole encounter. The woman stayed as well, but she'd moved her chair so it was facing away from us, which was somehow both a relief and oddly petty. Every so often we'd notice her typing intensely on her phone, presumably drafting more complaints or efficiency proposals for hotel management. When we finally gathered our things to leave, we had to walk past where she was sitting. She looked up from her phone and made one final comment about hoping we'd enjoyed monopolising the premium pool seating. I didn't respond, but my partner, who'd been remarkably restrained throughout this entire situation, stopped and very calmly told her that moving other people's belongings without permission was inappropriate regardless of her opinions about seating efficiency, and that maybe she should spend less time trying to reorganize public spaces and more time learning basic respect for other people's property. The woman opened her mouth to respond, but my partner was already walking away, and I hurried to catch up. As we were leaving the pool area, I heard her call out something about sensitivity and an inability to handle constructive feedback about resource management, but we kept walking. The rest of our weekend was thankfully uneventful, though we opted to skip the pool on Sunday morning just to avoid any possibility of another encounter. That story is over. This woman really developed an entire philosophy about optimal pool, chair allocation, and believed her efficiency theories justified moving strangers' belongings and appropriating their reserved seating. Some people are so convinced of their superior understanding of how shared spaces should function that they'll violate basic social norms while genuinely believing they're improving everyone's experience rather than just being incredibly presumptuous and disruptive. Our next story involves a bookstore encounter where someone apparently believed that reading material in public spaces automatically qualified as a free lending library with no return requirements. I work part-time at an independent bookstore in my neighbourhood, one of those places that somehow survive despite the rise of online retailers and ebooks. It's a cosy shop with creaky wooden floors, floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the kind of atmosphere that makes people want to spend hours browsing, even if they only came in for one specific title. We've built a loyal customer base over the years, people who appreciate the personal recommendations and the community events we host. It's become more than just a place to buy books. It's a gathering space for readers in our area. Last Tuesday evening, about an hour before closing time, I was restocking some recent arrivals in the fiction section when I noticed a woman settling into one of our reading chairs with a stack of books. We have several comfortable chairs scattered throughout the store specifically to encourage people to browse and sample books before buying them. It's always been part of our philosophy that people should be able to get a feel for a book before committing to purchase, and the chairs help create that welcoming environment we're known for. This woman had collected probably 6 or 7 books from various sections and had arranged them on the small table next to her chair. She'd taken off her shoes, tucked her feet underneath her, and appeared to be settling in for an extended reading session. This wasn't particularly unusual. We get people all the time who spend an hour or two reading in the store, especially on weekday evenings when it's quieter. What made this situation different was what happened as we approached closing time. I was making my rounds about 15 minutes before we closed, politely letting customers know we'd be wrapping up soon. Most people were already heading to the register with their purchases or putting books back on shelves before leaving. When I approached the woman in the reading chair, she had one book open in her lap and was deeply engrossed in whatever she was reading. I gave her the standard notification that we'd be closing in 15 minutes. She looked up briefly, acknowledged what I'd said with a quick nod, then immediately went back to reading. I moved on to check with other customers, assuming she'd start gathering her things. 15 minutes later, as I was preparing to lock the front door, she was still sitting in the same position, now what appeared to be a different book from her stack. My coworker had already finished counting the register and was ready to leave. I walked back over to the woman and mentioned that we were now closed and she'd need to either purchase her books or we could hold them for her to come back tomorrow. She looked genuinely surprised by this information. She said she hadn't finished reading yet and asked how much longer we'd be open. I explained that we'd already closed and really needed to lock up for the night. She glanced at the stack of books next to her chair and said she'd probably need at least another hour to get through the ones she wanted to finish. I told her that, unfortunately, wasn't possible, but she was welcome to come back tomorrow to continue reading. That's when she made a suggestion that completely caught me off guard. She asked if she could just take the books home with her to finish reading, then bring them back tomorrow when she came to the store again. She said it seemed inefficient for her to have to stop in the middle of reading just because the store had arbitrary closing hours. She mentioned that libraries let people check out books, so she didn't understand why a bookstore couldn't offer the same service for people who are actively engaged with the material. I explained that bookstores and libraries operated on fundamentally different models. Libraries owned books that were intended for circulation, while bookstores sold books as inventory. The books in our store weren't available for borrowing, they were merchandise for sale. She seemed to think this was an unnecessarily rigid distinction. She pointed out that she was a regular customer who'd bought books from us before, so surely we could make an exception and trust her to return the books. I told her I appreciated her patronage, but we simply couldn't let customers take unpurchased books out of the store. I offered again to hold the books behind the counter so she could continue reading them when she returned. She said that defeated the whole purpose because she wanted to finish them tonight at home. She mentioned she had a long commute and could read on the train, then finish the rest before bed. She started explaining her reasoning in more detail, going into this whole thing about how bookstores would actually benefit from letting serious readers borrow books before buying them. She said people would be more likely to purchase books if they could fully evaluate them first, rather than making decisions based on just reading a few pages in the store. She seemed to genuinely believe she was proposing an innovative business model rather than asking to walk out with merchandise she hadn't paid for. I remained firm that we couldn't allow unpurchased books to leave the store. She asked to speak with a manager, apparently hoping someone with more authority might be swayed by her arguments about beneficial business practices. I explained that I was the closing manager that evening and the decision wasn't going to change. She could buy the books, we could hold them for her, or she could leave them here and start fresh with them tomorrow. She sat there for another moment, looking at her stack of books like she was trying to calculate whether any of them were worth actually purchasing. She picked up one title, examined the back cover, checked the price, then set it down again. She repeated this process with several books, each time seeming disappointed by the price or deciding she wasn't quite committed enough to buy it. Finally, she asked if we had a rental program where she could pay a small fee to borrow books for a few days. I told her we didn't have any kind of rental program, but again mentioned that the public library a few blocks away did offer exactly that service for free. She said she'd been to that library and they didn't have the specific books she wanted to read. She seemed to think this somehow strengthened her case for why we should let her borrow our inventory. If the library didn't have these titles and she didn't want to buy them, her only option was for us to create an impromptu lending system just for her. My coworker, who'd been waiting patiently by the door for the past 20 minutes, came over and reiterated that we really needed to close up now. The woman finally stood up from her chair, taking her time, putting her shoes back on and gathering her bag. She asked one more time if we were absolutely certain she couldn't just take one or two of the books with her overnight. She promised she'd have them back first thing in the morning. He even offered to leave her driver's license as collateral. I explained that even with collateral, our inventory system didn't accommodate lending books to customers. Every book in the store was accounted for as merchandise, and removing items without processing a sale would create problems with our inventory tracking and financial records. She seemed frustrated by what she characterised as unnecessary bureaucracy getting in the way of customer service. She picked up one of the books from her stack, a paperback that had been published recently, and had a price sticker showing $22. She stared at it for a long moment, then asked if we could give her a discount since she was planning to read it in one night and would likely have it finished before she could return it. She suggested we think of it more like a rental fee than a purchase price, maybe charge her $5 or $10 since she'd only have the book for such a short time. I told her that wasn't how our pricing worked. The books were priced at what they were priced at, and we couldn't create custom rental rates based on how quickly someone planned to read them. She set the book back down and announced she'd just come back tomorrow to finish reading it in the store. She said she'd make sure to arrive earlier so she'd have more time before we closed. As she was finally heading toward the door, she turned back and asked if she could at least take photos of the pages she hadn't finished reading. She pulled out her phone and started explaining that she could photograph maybe 20 or 30 pages, read them at home, then come back tomorrow to continue where she left off. I told her that photographing substantial portions of books in the store was actually a copyright issue, and we'd prefer she didn't do that. She seemed amazed that there were so many restrictions on how she could interact with books she was genuinely interested in reading. She made this comment about how bookstores seemed designed to prevent people from actually engaging with books, rather than encouraging reading. I pointed out that the entire purpose of a bookstore was to sell books to people who wanted to read them, and that buying a book was the standard way to gain unlimited access to its contents. She finally left, but not before informing us she'd be leaving a review online about our inflexible policies and unwillingness to accommodate serious readers. My co-worker and I locked up after she was gone, both of us somewhat bewildered by the interaction. We'd dealt with difficult customers before, people who wanted discounts or had complaints about our selection, but someone trying to establish a personal lending library arrangement with our retail inventory was a new one. The next evening, she did return to the store. I watched from behind the counter as she collected the same stack of books and returned to the same reading chair. She spent about 2 hours working through her pile, occasionally glancing up at the clock like she was monitoring how much reading time she had before we closed. When I gave the 15-minute warning, she immediately started reading faster, her eyes racing across the pages like she was in some kind of speed reading competition. This pattern continued for several more days. She'd come in during the evening, claim the same chair, collect books she wanted to read, and spend hours going through them without ever purchasing anything. She'd carefully time her visits to maximize reading time, while avoiding any expectation that she might actually buy something. Other customers occasionally needed to wait for the chair she occupied, since she'd essentially homesteaded it as her personal reading spot. After about a week of this, my manager had a conversation with her about the purpose of our reading chairs. She explained that they were intended for customers to preview books before purchase, not as a free reading room for people who had no intention of buying anything. The woman argued that she'd never explicitly said she wouldn't buy books. She was just taking her time making informed purchasing decisions. She claimed she needed to fully read books before committing to buy them, and rushing that process would be bad for both her and the bookstore, since she might end up buying books she didn't actually want. My manager suggested she might be better served by utilising the public library for this kind of extended reading before purchasing. The woman said she'd already explained that the library didn't have the new releases she was interested in, and since we did stock those titles, we should accommodate her reading process. My manager told her that while she was welcome to browse and preview books, spending hours reading entire books without ever making a purchase wasn't really in the spirit of how the store was meant to operate. The woman seemed offended by this conversation. She said she'd been a customer for years, though when my manager checked our records, her actual purchase history showed she'd bought exactly 3 books in the past 18 months. She said those purchases demonstrated her commitment to the store and should earn her the right to spend as much time as she wanted reading unpurchased books. My manager disagreed and asked her to please limit her in-store reading sessions to a reasonable amount of time and to make purchases more regularly if she was going to continue using our space so extensively. She stopped coming to the store after that conversation, but about 2 weeks later, she posted a lengthy review on multiple platforms accusing us of discriminating against serious readers and creating barriers to literary engagement. She characterised the store as being more interested in quick sales than fostering a genuine reading community. Several regular customers who actually knew our store responded to her reviews, pointing out that we hosted free author events, ran book clubs, and regularly supported local literacy programs, but she maintained her position that being asked to actually purchase books, rather than just reading them for free in our chairs, constituted anti-reader hostility. That story is over. This woman really convinced herself that a retail bookstore should function as her personal library with extended reading privileges, and when asked to either purchase books or use actual library services, framed it as persecution of dedicated readers rather than a reasonable expectation that stores exist to sell merchandise. Some people construct elaborate justifications for why normal commercial boundaries shouldn't apply to them, then position themselves as victims when asked to follow the same rules as everyone else. Our next story is another gym tale and comes from someone who discovered that their gym nemesis had been sabotaging their workouts in the most petty way imaginable. I'd been going to the same gym for about 3 years, always showing up at 6 in the morning before work to get my routine done. I'm a creature of habit, so I'd follow the same circuit of machines and free weights every single day. There was this guy named Derek who started coming around the same time about 8 months ago, and at first we had that typical gym bro nod of acknowledgement thing going on. Nothing weird, just 2 people sharing space while trying to better themselves. But then I started noticing strange things happening with my workouts. I'd set up a barbell with my weights, walk away for 30 seconds to grab my water bottle, and come back to find the weights changed. Not dramatically. Just enough that when I'd go to lift, I'd struggle way more than I should have, or it would feel suspiciously light. At first, I thought I was losing my mind or just having off days, but it kept happening with such consistency that I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. I started paying closer attention and realised Derek was always nearby when these changes happened. He'd be on a machine with a perfect view of whatever station I was using, and I'd catch him glancing over more often than normal. The guy had this smirk on his face whenever I'd struggle with a weight that should have been manageable, and that's when I understood this wasn't coincidence. This dude was actively messing with my workout routine for his own entertainment. The sabotage escalated beyond just changing weights. I'd set my gym bag down in a specific spot, and it would somehow migrate across the room. My water bottle would go missing from where I'd placed it, only to turn up in the weirdest locations. Once I found it inside a locker that wasn't even mine, and I have no idea how it got there, since I'd been watching my stuff pretty carefully by that point. Derek was playing some kind of psychological game, and honestly, it was starting to mess with my head more than my actual workouts. I tried confronting him once, very casually, just asking if he'd noticed anyone messing with equipment or moving people's belongings around. He played completely innocent, suggesting that maybe I was just distracted or stressed from work, and not remembering where I'd put things. The gaslighting was so smooth and practiced that I almost questioned my own sanity for a moment. But I knew what was happening, and I knew Derek was behind it all. That's when I decided to turn his own tactics against him, but with a level of creativity that would make the whole situation unforgettable for him. I spent a week studying Derek's routine just as carefully as he'd apparently been studying mine. The guy was incredibly predictable, almost robotically so. He'd start with the treadmill for exactly 20 minutes, then move to the bench press, followed by a specific circuit of arm exercises, and he'd finish with abs. Every single day, the same pattern, the same machines, the same timing. Derek had this particular quirk where he'd leave his phone on top of his gym bag while he worked out, always keeping it in view, but not actually on his person. He was one of those people who needed to document every workout for social media, taking photos between sets and posting updates about his gym progress. His phone was essentially his most prized possession during these morning sessions, and he guarded it carefully. I started my revenge plan on a Monday morning, arriving 15 minutes earlier than usual to set everything up. I'd purchased a small Bluetooth speaker that was identical to the ones the gym used for their sound system, except this one was under my complete control via an app on my phone. I carefully positioned it behind some equipment, near where Derek always set up his station, making sure it was hidden but had clear audio projection to his area. The first day, I let him get comfortable in his routine. Right when he was in the middle of his heaviest bench press set, I activated the speaker and played a recording of someone loudly counting reps, but with the numbers all wrong. instead of counting up normally, the voice would go 3, 7, 2, 9, 1 in this completely random pattern. I could see Derek's concentration completely shatter as he tried to figure out where this voice was coming from and why it was counting his reps incorrectly. He looked around confused, but couldn't locate the source of the sound, and by the time he'd racked his weights to investigate, I'd already turned it off. The second day, I escalated things slightly. I'd recorded various gym sounds, grunts, weights clanging, equipment squeaking, and I'd play them at random intervals whenever Derek was trying to focus on his lifts. The audio would come from different directions since I'd repositioned the speaker overnight, and I could see him getting increasingly paranoid about phantom gym members who seemed to be working out invisibly around him. He'd look over his shoulder constantly, trying to figure out who was making these noises, but there was never anyone there. By day 3, Derek was visibly on edge when he arrived at the gym. His confident swagger had been replaced with this nervous energy, and he kept glancing around like he was expecting something weird to happen. That's when I decided to really mess with his head. I'd created a custom playlist of motivational gym phrases, but I'd edited them to be slightly off, or weirdly specific. Things like, "You can do it, Derek, just 3 more reps of mediocrity," or "Feeling the burn of average performance," would play at random moments during his workout. The beautiful part was watching Derek try to figure out if these messages were real gym announcements or if he was losing his mind. He'd pause mid-exercise and look around to see if anyone else was reacting to these bizarre motivational messages, but of course, no one else could hear them since they were coming from my hidden speaker, not the actual gym sound system. I could see him questioning his own perception of reality, which was exactly what he'd been doing to me for months with his sabotage. Day 4 brought my masterpiece. I'd noticed that Derek always took a selfie after his workout. Same spot every day, same pose, same caption about crushing his fitness goals. So I set up my speaker directly behind where he'd stand for his photo, and I waited. Sure enough, after his workout, Derek positioned himself for his daily selfie, flexing and getting his angles right. The moment he raised his phone to take the picture, I activated a recording of the most embarrassing sounds I could create. A combination of loud bodily functions, someone tripping and falling, and various other mortifying noises that would be perfectly captured in his video if he was recording. Derek's face went from confident gym bro to absolute horror as he realised these sounds were happening right behind him during his sacred selfie moment. He spun around expecting to find someone in distress or causing a scene, but there was nothing there. Several other gym members had looked over when they heard the commotion, and Derek was left standing there trying to explain what had just happened, except he couldn't explain it because there was no visible source for the sounds. The final phase of my revenge came on day 5. I'd created a recording that was just various people's voices having a conversation about someone who messes with other people's gym equipment. The dialogue was very specific, talking about how immature and insecure someone would have to be to sabotage another person's workout, how that kind of behaviour showed serious character flaws, and how karma always catches up with people who can't just let others exist peacefully. I played this conversation at a volume that was just barely audible, like Derek was overhearing people talking nearby, and I watched him freeze when he recognised the topic being discussed. Derek's workout that morning was the shortest I'd ever seen. He packed up his stuff within 20 minutes and left the gym looking absolutely shaken. He didn't come back for an entire week, and when he finally returned, his demeanour had completely changed. There was no more smirking, no more hovering near my equipment, no more mysterious changes to my weights or missing water bottles. He'd stay on his side of the gym, keep his head down, and get through his workout without any of his previous attitude. I never told Derek that I was behind his week of psychological torment, and I didn't need to. The point had been made effectively without any confrontation or drama. He'd learned what it felt like to question your own sanity and wonder if someone was messing with you, which was exactly the experience he'd been creating for me for months. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even through direct confrontation, but about making someone experience the same confusion and frustration they'd been inflicting on others. The hidden speaker stayed in place for another 2 weeks, but I never activated it again. Just knowing it was there, and knowing that Derek was probably still paranoid about mysterious sounds and voices, was satisfaction enough. Eventually, Derek switched to afternoon workouts, apparently deciding that the 6 morning slot had too much weird energy for his liking. My workouts returned to peaceful, uninterrupted sessions where my weights stayed exactly where I put them, and my belongings remained unmoved. That story shows that sometimes psychological warfare is more effective than any physical confrontation, especially when dealing with someone who thinks they're clever for their petty sabotage. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their roommate had been lying about paying shared bills and decided to teach them a lesson about financial responsibility. I'd been living with my roommate Jessica for about 14 months when I started noticing some inconsistencies with our utility bills and rent payments. We'd set up a system where she'd collect my half of everything and then handle the actual payments to our landlord and the various utility companies. It seemed like a convenient arrangement since her schedule was more flexible than mine, and I trusted her to handle the administrative side of our shared expenses. Jessica would send me detailed breakdowns of what I owed each month, and I'd transfer my portion promptly through our banking app. The amounts seemed reasonable, maybe slightly higher than I'd expected based on what friends were paying for similar apartments, but I figured costs varied by location and usage. I'm not someone who obsesses over every dollar, so I paid what she asked without questioning the specifics too much. The first hint that something was wrong came when I received a notice from our apartment complex about late rent payment. According to the letter, we were 2 months behind on rent and facing potential eviction proceedings if we didn't catch up immediately. I was completely confused because I'd been giving Jessica my half of the rent on time every single month without fail. When I confronted her about the notice, she seemed equally surprised and insisted there must be some administrative error with the landlord's office. She promised to sort it out immediately and assured me that our rent had definitely been paid. Jessica made a big show of calling the landlord while I was present, having this very convincing conversation about payment records and bank transfers. She hung up and told me everything was sorted, that they'd found the missing payments in their system, and we were actually current on rent. She even showed me a text message from a number she claimed was the landlord, confirming that the late notice had been sent in error. I felt relieved and didn't think much more about it, trusting that Jessica had handled the situation. But then I started receiving calls from the utility companies about past due balances on our electricity and internet services. Each time Jessica would handle the situation with the same pattern, acting shocked, making calls in front of me, and showing me text confirmations that everything was resolved. She'd sometimes ask me to chip in a little extra to cover what she called processing fees or reconnection charges, which I'd pay because I didn't want our services disrupted. The truth came out in the most unexpected way possible. I ran into our landlord at the grocery store and he pulled me aside to discuss our rent situation. He explained that we were actually 4 months behind at this point and that he'd been trying to work with us to create a payment plan, but Jessica kept making promises without following through. He said he really didn't want to evict us, but he had his own mortgage to pay and couldn't continue letting us live rent-free. I was absolutely stunned and told him I'd been paying my half of the rent to Jessica every single month without missing a payment. The landlord looked equally confused and pulled out his phone to show me his payment records. According to his documentation, Jessica had only made 2 partial rent payments in the past 6 months, despite me transferring thousands of dollars to her account for rent during that same period. When I got home, I immediately checked my banking records and started adding up every transfer I'd made to Jessica for rent, utilities, and various shared expenses. The total was shocking, over $9,000 in just under 6 months. I'd essentially been paying far more than my half should have been, and apparently none of it had been going where it was supposed to go. Jessica had been collecting my money and spending it on herself while letting our bills go unpaid. I decided not to confront Jessica directly about what I'd discovered. Instead, I started documenting everything and putting together a plan that would expose her theft while protecting myself from the financial consequences of her actions. First, I went to the landlord and explained the situation in detail, showing him my bank transfers to Jessica and asking if we could work out an arrangement where I'd pay my portion of the back rent directly to him. He was understanding once he realised I'd been defrauded by my roommate, and we created a payment plan that would get my portion of the debt cleared over 3 months. Next, I contacted each utility company and explained that I'd been paying my roommate for services that weren't being paid to them. I provided documentation of my transfers and worked out arrangements to have the accounts put solely in my name with new payment methods that Jessica wouldn't have access to. The utility companies were surprisingly helpful once they understood I was the victim of my roommate's theft rather than a willing participant in avoiding payments. Then I started setting up my exit strategy from the apartment. I found a new place, arranged for movers, and got everything ready for a quick departure without tipping off Jessica about my plans. I opened a new bank account that she wouldn't know about and rerouted my direct deposit to ensure she couldn't somehow access any more of my money. The confrontation came on a Saturday morning when I'd already moved most of my important belongings to a storage unit without Jessica noticing. I'd arranged for witnesses, our landlord, and a police officer who'd agreed to be present for what I described as a potentially volatile roommate. It's a dispute over theft. When Jessica woke up and came into the living room, she found me sitting with documentation spread across the coffee table and 2 very serious-looking men waiting to hear her explanation. I walked through every transfer I'd made to her, every bill that hadn't been paid, and every lie she'd told about resolving the payment issues. The police officer took notes while the landlord confirmed which payments had actually been received. Jessica tried several different approaches to defend herself, claiming she'd been struggling financially and had meant to catch up on everything, suggesting I'd agreed to cover more of the expenses because I made more money, and even attempting to blame me for not paying attention to our shared finances. But the documentation was overwhelming and undeniable. I had bank records showing exactly what I'd paid and when, text messages where Jessica confirmed receiving my money for specific bills, and statements from the landlord and utility companies showing what had actually been paid. There was no way for Jessica to explain away the nearly $7,000 gap between what I'd given her and what she'd actually paid toward our shared expenses. The police officer explained to Jessica that this was textbook theft and fraud, and that I had grounds to press criminal charges if I chose to do so. He also mentioned that this kind of systematic theft from a roommate was taken quite seriously by prosecutors because it showed premeditation and ongoing deception rather than a one-time mistake. Jessica's face went white as she realised the potential legal consequences of her actions. I told Jessica I'd be willing not to press criminal charges if she agreed to several conditions. She'd have to sign a promissory note acknowledging the debt and committing to a repayment plan. She'd have to move out within 30 days and find someone to take over her portion of the lease. And she'd have to provide a written confession that I could use if she ever tried to claim I owed her money or damage my reputation in our social circles. Jessica agreed to everything immediately, clearly desperate to avoid criminal prosecution. The next month was awkward as Jessica scrambled to find a new roommate and pack her belongings. She kept trying to minimise what she'd done, suggesting we were both at fault somehow, and that I was being dramatic by involving the landlord and police. But every time she'd start with her manipulation tactics, I'd remind her that I had documentation of her theft and witnesses to her confession, which would shut down the gaslighting pretty quickly. Jessica moved out 3 weeks later, and the new roommate who took over her portion of the lease was someone I'd actually found and vetted myself to make sure we wouldn't repeat this nightmare scenario. The promissory note Jessica signed included automatic wage garnishment provisions if she missed payments, which meant I didn't have to chase her down for the money she owed. Small amounts started appearing in my account every month as her paychecks were docked to repay her debt. The most satisfying part came about 6 months later when I ran into mutual friends who'd heard Jessica's version of our roommate split. She'd apparently been telling people that I'd been financially controlling and had forced her out over minor disagreements about shared expenses. I simply pulled out my phone and showed them the documentation, the thousands in unpaid bills, the confession she'd signed, and the repayment plan that was currently garnishing her wages. Watching their expressions change from sympathy for Jessica to shock at her audacity was incredibly vindicating. That story proves that the best response to financial betrayal isn't emotional confrontation, but methodical documentation and strategic action that leaves no room for manipulation or lies. Our next story comes from someone who realised their coworker had been taking credit for their project ideas in meetings and found the perfect way to expose the fraud. I'd been working at a marketing firm for about 2 years when I noticed my colleague Marcus had developed an interesting habit of presenting my ideas as his own during client meetings. It started small, just rephrasing something I'd mentioned in our team brainstorming sessions and presenting it slightly differently to our boss. But it escalated over time to the point where Marcus was essentially stealing my entire creative concepts and getting recognition for work I'd developed independently. The frustrating part was how smooth Marcus was at making the theft seem natural. He'd always add some minor modification or twist to my original idea, just enough that he could claim he'd been developing his own version simultaneously if anyone questioned him. He'd say things like, "I've been thinking along similar lines," or "great minds think alike," if I ever tried to assert that the concept had originated with me. Our boss seemed to prefer Marcus's confident presentation style over my more reserved approach, so even when I'd point out that I'd suggested something similar earlier, Marcus would get the credit for having refined it or made it client-ready. I started keeping detailed notes about every idea I shared in meetings, complete with timestamps, and any witnesses who'd heard me present the concepts first. I'd document my creative process, save early drafts, and basically create an evidence trail that would prove these ideas originated with me rather than Marcus. But I wasn't sure how to use this information without seeming petty or unprofessional, and I didn't want to damage my reputation by appearing like I couldn't handle normal workplace competition. The opportunity for perfect revenge presented itself when our firm landed a major client who wanted a comprehensive rebranding campaign. This was the kind of project that could define someone's career, and I knew Marcus would be desperate to claim credit for whatever successful concepts emerged, so I developed an elaborate trap that would expose his theft in the most public and undeniable way possible. I created 3 different campaign concepts, but I only fully developed one of them. This complete version was brilliant, genuinely innovative work that I was proud of, and I kept it entirely private without sharing any details with anyone at the firm. The other 2 concepts I deliberately designed to be impressive on the surface, but fundamentally flawed in ways that would only become apparent during actual implementation or client presentation. In our team meetings, I carefully shared the 2 flawed concepts, presenting them with enthusiasm and detail, while keeping my actually good idea completely secret. I made sure Marcus was present for these presentations and even encouraged his input, knowing he'd be mentally cataloguing everything for his own use. I could see him taking notes and asking leading questions, clearly planning to appropriate these ideas for his own presentation to the client. Sure enough, When it came time for our individual pitch meetings with the client, Marcus presented both of my deliberately flawed concepts as his own original work. He'd added some surface-level modifications, but the core ideas were clearly what I'd shared in our team meetings. He was confident and polished in his presentation, and I could see our boss nodding along, impressed with what he thought was Marcus's creative thinking. Then it was my turn to present. I completely ignored the concepts I'd shared in team meetings, and instead unveiled my secret third campaign, the one I'd fully developed without any input or knowledge from Marcus. It was innovative, comprehensive, and directly addressed the client's needs in ways that my two flawed concepts deliberately hadn't. The contrast between Marcus's flashy but problematic ideas and my thoroughly researched, strategically sound campaign was immediately obvious to everyone in the room. The client loved my concept and approved it on the spot for full development. But more importantly, our boss had just witnessed Marcus presenting ideas that clearly came from our team meetings, while I'd somehow developed an entirely separate campaign that was superior in every way. The implication was clear. If Marcus was presenting team concepts as his own work, what else had he been taking credit for that wasn't actually his? After the meeting, I privately showed our boss my documentation of the creative process, including early drafts, research notes, and timestamps proving when I developed each concept. I explained that I deliberately shared the flawed ideas in team meetings to test whether Marcus would present them as his own work, which he had. Then I showed my boss months of similar documentation proving that Marcus had been systematically stealing my ideas and presenting them as his original work. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. Our boss could see the pattern of theft and the deliberate deception Marcus had been practicing. More damaging was the fact that Marcus had just confidently presented flawed ideas to a major client without understanding why they were problematic, proving he didn't actually comprehend the strategic thinking behind the concepts he was stealing. Marcus was reassigned to a different team where his work could be more closely monitored, and he was passed over for a promotion that had seemed certain before this incident. I got full credit for the successful campaign, along with a significant bonus and recognition as the project lead. But the most satisfying part was watching Marcus try to rebuild his credibility after being exposed as someone who couldn't distinguish between good and bad ideas because he'd never actually developed the strategic thinking skills required to evaluate concepts he was stealing. That story teaches us that sometimes the best way to catch a thief is to deliberately give them something that will expose their incompetence when they try to use it. That is where we will pause of the night, everyone. As always, Reddit produces the sleepy goods. If you enjoyed this batch of Reddit gems as much as I did, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you here again for another cozy night of Reddit and Stardew soon. Thanks for listening, and sweet dreams.